Thanks, Stephen. My name's Bob Davis. I'm an alcoholic. It's good to be here and good to be sober. And yeah, it's nice to be asked back anywhere. That wasn't always the case, and I'm sure there's a lot of people here probably relate to that. I like to start with a prayer, if you don't mind, so indulge me for just a minute. I ask God for strength that I might achieve, that I was made weak, that I might learn humbly to obey. I ask for health that I might do greater things, and I was given infirmity that I might do better things. I ask for riches that I might be happy, and I was given poverty that I might be wise. I ask for power that I might have the praise of men, and I was made weak that I might feel the need of God. I ask for all things that I might enjoy life, and I was given life that I might enjoy all things. I got nothing that I asked for, but I got everything I had hoped for. Almost despite myself, my unspoken prayers were answered. I am among all men and most richly blessed. Again, my name is Bob Davis. I'm an alcoholic. And Stephen, thank you so much for asking. It's always a joy and a privilege to be able to participate in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, AA is a funny place. It's the largest group of people in the world, none of which wanted to join. You know, I didn't want to join Alcoholics Anonymous. Wasn't a place I ever intended to go. For a long time after being here, I wasn't sure I wanted to be here or stay. But I have found here just a way of life that defies all understanding. You know, the program of recovery that's contained in the book Alcoholics Anonymous is divinely inspired. It's simple, but not easy. It's something if I do and I practice not perfectly, but at the best of my ability on a daily basis, guarantees me that I will develop a relationship with the power in my life that will guide, direct me, give me strength and courage to live life or accept life on life terms, but learn to live life on God's terms. And that's what I've found here. And I never know how this is going to turn out. I honestly never know what I'm going to say, really, other than the chronology of my life. But, I hope and I pray, and I did before we started, that, God will give me the words to touch somebody here and give them the inspiration that they can change their life like I changed mine with God's help. My sobriety date is April 13th, 1983. And no matter what I do, Stephen still got here a couple months before me. And it's really annoying, but it is the truth. And I have to respect that. And I love him. And, it's sometimes it's just hard to really fathom April 13th, 1983 to today and all that has happened in between. And not all of it's been good. Some of it's been tragic. Some of it's been very difficult. Some of it's been caused a lot of grief. And, but the program gives me a way to live with things and walk through them. And over a period of time, develop a dependence on God, as I understand it, that tells me inevitably and absolutely that it's going to be okay. No matter what it is, it's going to be okay. Because the chips are going to fall where they fall. And that's God's plan. And my job is just to take that plan and do the next thing in front of me and keep on moving. And so I don't spend a lot of time on what it was like. I mean, I grew up in a good family. I had great parents. They were good people. I had a brother and sister who had no trouble with alcoholism, drug addiction. I don't know that I thought that I was that different. I thought that all y'all were different. I thought I was fine. I thought y'all were all screwed up. That was my thinking. But I took a drink at 11 years old. My world went from black and white to technicolor, and I woke up sick as a dog the next morning, couldn't remember anything. And I had one thought. I said, man, when can I do that again? And from that age to the time I stopped, every time I got a chance to do that, I did it. Now, they don't let you out a whole lot at 11, but every time I got out, I got into something. And I didn't get in trouble every time I drank, but every time I got in trouble, I was drinking. You know, by the time I was 17, I left for college. My dad helped me pack a car to go to school. When he put the last box in the car, he stopped me, looked me dead in the eye, and he said, "I just want you to know you will never live here again." And he said, "You can come visit your mother, but you ain't ever gonna live here again." And I never did. Um, but I went to school. I went to school at East Carolina University. I spent the best 3 years of my life, my freshman year at East Carolina University. It was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And I started getting into trouble by the time from 17 to 23. I was arrested 56 times. I had 12 DUIs. I was shot 3 times. I've been in 5 or 6 head-on high-speed collisions and never really got much more than a scratch. You know, and I thought I was bad luck. But there was a period there, and I was 19 or so, and I'd had a particularly bad week where, you know, on a Thursday night, I'd been in a poker game with a friend, and he'd cheating the guy across the table in the card game, and the guy left. After he took all his money, went out to the car, got a shotgun, came back, blew my buddy's head off sitting right next to him. I picked up my bottle of liquor. I got in the car. I drove home, and I hit a train on the way home. I didn't hit it hard. I just kind of bumped into it. And the next night, I went to work and drove a car into the company car into the Pamlico River. Now I had decided it was a good idea about halfway through a double shift to go to the little bar down the road, buy a case of beer, and sit in the car I had to sit in that night and drink beer and listen to the Carolina basketball game on the radio. It was December 15th. And this place was a big mining company on the Pamlico River, and I fell asleep, knocked the car in gear, and drove it into the river. Now the next morning they came in to get the car out of the barge slip so the barges could come in and load fertilizer. And as they pulled it up out of the water, the beer can started floating out the window that I'd rolled down to swim out of it. And there was like 500 people there. So I quickly turned in my resignation. The next day I had a party because I was going back to school, and 3 people got shot in the front yard, and they took me to jail, not for shooting them, but I got in trouble. And I went back to school the next day, and that night I got a DUI and they put me in jail. Now I got beat up really bad that night in the jail, and I spent 3 days in the hospital. I had 6 broken ribs, dislocated jaw, both eyes were swollen shut. And I walked out of that jail that morning, and I was walking across campus to go to a friend's house to call my mother, what all grown men do when they're in trouble. And I went in and I picked up the phone. I called my mom, and I said for the first time, I said, "Mom, I don't know, but maybe I have a drinking problem." And she said, "Hold on, I'll call you right back." About 5 seconds later, the phone rang, and it was some guy from Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, mind you, I'm 19, my hair's down to my waist, both eyes are swollen shut, my jaw's crooked, and, you know, I can't walk with all the broken ribs. And the guy picked me up that night, took me to my first AA meeting. And I went to a meeting. It was in Plymouth, North Carolina, which is a little farming town outside of Greenville. And I went in, and it was, I don't know, about 20 people, old men, bib overalls, just got off a tractor, you know, looked like a field trip from the old folks home. And I looked around, and this guy walks over, a big tall guy with red hair, and he had on bib overalls, and he just smacked the table. And he said, "Kid," he said, "you look like you ought to try some controlled drinking." Now, he didn't tell me about the book Alcoholics Anonymous, steps, the program of recovery, or, you know, keep coming back, or 90. And well, they didn't say 90 and 90 back then where I was. And he just said, "You ought to go try some controlled drinking." I went to a second meeting. That was a Thursday night. On a Saturday night, I went to a second meeting. Same people were there. Same guy did the same thing. On Sunday night, I went back to where I was going back to school, and I decided I'd go out to my local watering hole and try some controlled drinking. I went out with the intention of having 3 drinks, and I got smashed and went back to jail. Now, that's the only time I ever recall trying to control my drinking at some amount. For the next 4.5 years, I woke up every morning, and I didn't know it then, I know it now. with those four guys that it talks about in Vision for You: terror, bewilderment, frustration, and despair, the four horsemen. You know, I woke up every morning of my life from that day till the day I walked back in Alcoholics Anonymous with the first thought being, I'm not going to drink today. I don't care what happens, I'm not going to drink today. And the second thought I had was, where did I leave that piece of bottle last night so I'd have something when I woke up? And every day was like that, every single day. Toward the end of that, I got married, moved to Raleigh. My wife was a nurse. And one day coming home from work drunk, I hit a car, hit a station wagon with a mother and three kids. And I went back to jail for what I hope's the last time. That was sometime in January of 1983. And I had never called my parents. Well, I called my dad the first time I went to jail. He hung up the phone. I never called him again. He told me a couple of weeks later, he said, boy, I don't think you give but one call when you go to jail. You probably shouldn't waste it. And I never called him again. But my wife called him that night. He and my mother came to the jail in Raleigh where I was at. And he came to deliver me a message. And he walked in like a general out of the military, walked up and looked me dead in the eye. And he said, you know, boy, he said, you are the biggest disappointment I've ever had. I wish you were never born. And man, I can still feel that now. Almost 40 years later, I can still feel it now. And all I could think when he said that was, damn you, if you only knew, if you only knew how bad I didn't want to drink, if you only knew how bad I wanted to be a good son, if you only knew how bad I wanted to be responsible, if you only knew how bad I wanted to show up, if you only knew how bad I wanted not to disappoint you and disrespect you and all that, you wouldn't say that, because I want to do that more than anything. I just can't. I can't. I got home that night. I called my mom again. I said, Mom, I definitely have a drinking problem. I got to do something. She said, hold on, I'll call you right back. And about 5 seconds later, the phone rang. Some guy from Alcoholics Anonymous. I mean, I'm convinced to this day she had one of those red hotline phones on the counter there in the kitchen to Alcoholics Anonymous, just waiting for me to say something. And as it was, I took a couple months before I could get in treatment. They had just opened a treatment center in Raleigh, the first one. It wasn't these 28-day treatment vacations in Florida. It was a 10-day deal where they basically told you just a few things. They told you about the disease of alcoholism. They told you it'd be best if you didn't drink, and they told you the best way to do that was get involved in Alcoholics Anonymous. They had a meeting there that night, the first night I was there, Wednesday, April 13th, 1983. There was a guy there that was obviously the most popular guy in the room. He run around there like a bantam rooster, squawking about Alcoholics Anonymous and how great life was, and everybody wanted to talk to him. And you know, he was dressed up. He had a pinstripe suit on and a freshly pressed white shirt. He had a red tie on. He was an Italian guy with dark skin. He had a big scar down the side of his face. He looked like a little gangster, you know, and I always wanted to be a gangster. And after the meeting, I slinked up to him and I got his attention. And I asked him, I said, would you be my sponsor? And now he looked at me up and down, and he looked at me for a minute, and he said, boy, or kids, what he said. He said, kid, everything about you tells me that I ought to run away from you as fast as I can. He said, but I tell you what, he said, if you're willing to go to any length to get sober, he said, I will go to hell and back. And he said, if you're not, you can go to hell by yourself. Sit down and shut up. He said, I don't want to know your opinion. If I want it, I'll give it to you. You know, I don't want to hear your feelings, or, you know, don't tell me about your problems. I don't care. Just sit down and shut up and listen. On the front row, too. And I thought, man, that's not kind and loving towards all. It's not very nice. Didn't know they treated people like that. They've been talking about this friendly fellowship, you know, all day in that treatment center. And next night, he picked me up and took me to a meeting. He took me to his home group. He said, this is your home group now. He said, stand outside the door there and greet people when they come in. I said, well, I don't know anybody. He said, I don't care who you know. Just say hello. Tell them who you are. Ask them who they are. Talk to them. So I did. Now, but Lee Calder was, only way I can describe it, Lee was a don't drink and go to meetings guy. He was a putting the plug in the jug guy. And I'm not judging that. That's just what he was. I didn't work the steps with him. We didn't read the book. We just went to meetings, and he picked me up every night, took me to a meeting every night, because I didn't have any license for 3.5 years after I got sober. And but for the first 8 or 9 months, he picked me up every night and took me to a meeting, because my wife had got an out. And when I asked her to take me to a meeting, she said, "Find your own damn meeting. I didn't get you where you are." She'd been with the Sisters of Perpetual Resentment for long enough to know she didn't have to do anything for me. It was my job to get sober. And but he did. He picked me up and took me to meetings, and all the way there, he talked about AA and how wonderful it was. And you know, I'd heard stories about Lee, and he's a wonderful man. And I hope nobody gets the impression I think anything else. He's a wonderful, wonderful man. But I'd heard stories about him, and when he spoke in town, he spoke all over the place. He didn't tell his whole story. But when he went out of town, he would tell his whole story. And he took me out of town a couple months sober, and he told his whole story. And his whole story in a nutshell was that, you know, as an 18-year-old kid, he'd been in a bar drinking, and he got in a fight with 3 guys, and they beat him up really bad. And he went home, got a gun, came back and killed all 3 of them. And he spent 25 years in the penitentiary for that. And you couldn't be around Lee Calder much and not know that he loved Alcoholics Anonymous. But anyway, I went home that night, and I told my wife that story. And I told her, I said, you know, I don't know what I'm going to do. And she said, you better do whatever the hell he tells you to do. And I did. You know, I did. And what Lee told me to do was don't drink, go to meetings, and be of service. And I did. But I mean, here's the problem with that. And this is just me. This is my experience. That my alcoholism only begins to affect me when I stop drinking. When I'm drinking, alcohol affects me, the consequences of my stupidity and making dumb decisions because I drank too much. When I stop drinking, I get restless, irritable, and discontent. My mind starts working and it won't stop. You know, I got questions and I got answers, no questions. You know, I got all the answers, no questions. And I did that for over a year, a little bit over a year. And after that time, going to meetings every day and making coffee and greeting and washing coffee cups and ashtrays and mopping floors and setting up tables and chairs and doing all the wonderful service that we can do in a home group, I was sitting on the couch with a gun in my mouth because I hadn't done anything about my alcoholism. You know, see, 2 great powers in AA, the power of the fellowship, which is a sufficient substitute for alcohol. And for me, it was a substitute for about a year, but it's not a sufficient substitute for alcoholism. For that, I need the program of recovery that's in the book, Alcoholics Anonymous. And as it turned out, I had to move, and I tried to get a sponsor in a new little town I was in, Oxford, North Carolina. And I tried a couple guys, and they turned out to be don't drink, go to meetings guys, and it just wasn't working. And I got asked to go to a spiritual retreat on Mother's Day weekend in 1984. So I'm about 14 months sober, and I go to this 11-step retreat called Camp Monroe, and it's been going on since the 50s. And that weekend, there were a couple of speakers there that changed my life. And one was later would become my sponsor. His name was Tom Ivester, and Tom's still alive. He's got 65 years, but he's dying of Alzheimer's now in a rest home in North Carolina. And the other one was a guy named Art Graham, who was a Presbyterian minister from outside of Richmond in Mechanicsville, Virginia. And Tom spoke on Saturday night. It was most amazing thing I'd ever heard. He was 52 years old at the time. He was 27 years sober. He got sober at 25. I was 24. And I spent a lot of time talking to him that weekend. And one of the things he told me, and he told me many times after that, you know, at some point you got to give your life to this fellowship, kid. He said, at some point you got to give your life to this fellowship. And he said, I don't mean you go sleep in the AA clubhouse. He said, what I mean is Alcoholics Anonymous, and your sobriety and your recovery becomes your number one priority. And no matter what else is going on, that's number one. You know, if you don't have that, you won't have a family, you won't have a job, you won't have a car, you won't have any money. You'll be on the streets again. You'll be out of everything. And he said, that has to be it. And you need to get you need to get into the steps and that inventory in particular. And, you know, Art was, again, he was a minister, but he talked about God in a way like I'd never heard. And it wasn't like a religious man. It was like a man who had lost his faith and lost his God and came in Alcoholics Anonymous and rediscovered his faith and rediscovered his religion and his spiritual beliefs in Alcoholics Anonymous after having been a reverend and a preacher for many years. And I went home that Sunday in the afternoon, and the lady who took me, her name was Mary Nell Newcomb, and Mary Nell was kind of the matriarch of AA in the little town I lived in. And on the way home, she looked at me in the car and she said, you know, you're a phony. And if you don't do something, you're going to die. And I said, well, I've tried to find a sponsor and I haven't had any luck yet. What do you suggest I do? And I asked her, I said, you want a sponsor? And she said, sure, I'll sponsor you. And we went home that Sunday. It would have been Mother's Day in 1984, May 10th, I believe it was. And we sat down at her kitchen table and we started reading the book, Alcoholics Anonymous. And my life's never been the same. It's never been the same. And she opened up that book to the first page where there's nothing. And she said, this is what you know nothing. She said, but together we're going to learn it all. She said, I'm going to share with you the miracle of my life. And in that, you're going to find a relationship with God as you understand God. And he will serve to guide and direct you and give you strength and courage that you need to live life. And we started doing that. And I come in Alcoholics Anonymous knowing absolutely, I was convinced to my innermost self when I walked in the door that I could not drink. I knew that if I drank, I knew if I continued to drink, I was going to die, and I knew I could not drink. But what I did know is what I discovered in the first year of going to meetings and not drinking. That my life was not unmanageable because I drank. My life was unmanageable because I tried to manage it. You know, that I needed a new manager. I needed a new director. I needed a new principal. I needed a new father. The book talks about all those things. I needed those things in my life, but I had no idea how to do that. And I had no confidence or belief that that could happen. And, you know, because we get to a second and a third step, and I tell her very honestly, I said, Mary, no, I can't do this. And she said, why can't you do this? I said, because I don't believe this stuff. And I was just being honest. And she said, where does it say you have to believe anything? I said, well, it says it right there in the step. It says came to believe. And she said, no, it doesn't. You're an idiot. She said, it doesn't say that at all. It says you came to believe over a period of time. Came to believe. What does that mean? It means over a period of time. I come to believe in something. You don't have to believe now. I mean, she always used the book. She takes me to the book and she said, here's the two things you have to do. You have to express a willingness to believe. Could you consider the idea? Could you consider the idea that there exists a power greater than you? She said, and if you can now exhibit that willingness, then you have to drop your prejudice and express even a willingness to believe. And if you are your own way, do you now believe, or are you willing to believe that there exists a power in this world that's greater than you? And I said, well, I don't know. She said, do you believe that I said, yeah, I believe you believe. I hate you for it. You know, you got something I want. I don't know that I can get it. She said, oh, you can get it. I guarantee you can get it. She said, you just work the second step. She said, let's make this decision. And I said, again, I'm not sure I can do it. She said, well, let me explain it to you. She said, the decision you make at this point is not to turn your life over to God. It's to turn it over to the care of God. Big difference. That word care makes a big difference. She really stuck on that word. And she said, we're going to make a decision and we're going to do the rest of this work. Because, you know, and we agnostics, it says, you know, deep down in every man, woman, and child is a fundamental idea of God, but it may be obscured, blocked by three things: calamity, pomp, worship of other things. So the calamity, the nonsense that won't stop going around in my head, you know, the lies that I tell myself, you know, the conversations I have with people who aren't there, you know, the nonsense that I think. And she said, that's a calamity. She said, the pomp that the book talks about is your ego. The fact that you think you got all the answers. She said, you got all the answers, but you got none of the questions. She said, you need to discover the questions. And the book will give you the answer. And worship other things. I said, I don't think I worship other things. She said, oh, you don't worship money? Well, yeah, maybe. You don't worship success? Yeah, probably. She said, you don't worship what other people think about you? I said, yeah, probably. I mean, by the time she got finished, I worshiped everything that wasn't nailed down. And you know, I realized that, okay, this is beginning to make a little bit of sense. And so I decided to go through with it. You know, and I'll say this, and I say this a lot because it's what I read in our literature. And I hear people say, take your time on the steps, work a step a month or a step a year. And I'm not sure how many people that's killed, but that's not what it says in our book anyway. Uses words like immediately, at once, launched into, those kind of words. They're fast words. Do things quickly as you can, as long as you can do it thoroughly and honestly. Because it says, nothing counts but thoroughness and honesty. So, we got right to it. And I remember writing an inventory and I didn't pay any attention, went home, wrote a biography, brought it back. She looked at it for 13 seconds, balled it up, and threw it in the trash. And she said, go back and do it the way the book says. She said, and then I'll tell you why. She said, because that biography, you said there's wonderful, but 95% of it has nothing to do with your alcoholism. But it does an incredibly good job of hiding the 5% that does. She said, so go back and do 5 columns. And I did a Joe and Charlie type inventory because I just love those guys. And so who, what's it about? What part of self is affected? What's your part? What's the character? And we did that. And I love Chamberlain. Chamberlain said this process is about uncover, discover, and discard. And as I write the stuff, I begin to uncover things about myself that I'd never been able to see. My self-centeredness, my selfishness, my self-indulgence, everything's self. Everything's me, I. Everything's about me. You should be thinking about me. I think about me. Everybody think about me. And I began to see these things in my behavior, my relationships, and how I treated other people. And as I sit down with her and go through this inventory, I begin to discover things because she sees things that I'm unable to see. She begins to explain some things that she sees, and the picture becomes a little clearer. As the picture becomes clearer, I realize that I've set the ball in motion in every single case of my life, whether it be resentment, fear, or sex. That I'm the one that set the ball in motion in every single case. And we finish this inventory and I go in, she sends me into another room of her house for an hour. And she says, go sit down and consider what you've done so far, the first 5 proposals. And, have you made mortar without sand or the stones properly in place? Because, I love the analogies and the visuals that Bill builds through the book, that we're building this archway with willingness is the foundation. Step 2 is a cornerstone. Step 3 is a keystone. And the rest of the steps kind of fill in this archway. And if I finish this work, I walk through this archway into the spiritual world of paradoxes that is nothing like I thought it was. And it's an amazing thing. But I sit down for this hour and, I didn't have this tremendous spiritual experience, but what I did have was exactly what the book talks about. We thank God from the bottom of our heart. We know him better. I don't know him well, but I know him better. And I begin to have this relationship, or the beginnings of a relationship with a power in my life that will get stronger and stronger as time goes on if I continue to seek. You see, I don't find God. God's not lost. It's in the seeking that God begins to reveal himself. And it begins to do that in step 5. And, we sat down quickly after that. We were, I was very willing to get rid of defects. I didn't know what that meant, but I was willing. I asked God to remove them. And I always wondered why steps 6 and 7 are so short in the book. And I've realized now, at least for me, it's because the actual work of step 6 and 7 occurs in step 10. But, we move on to these amends, and check myself for time here. I'm almost be 63 years old in 3 or 4 weeks. And in all that time, there's nothing there. Steps 8 and 9 are the most spiritual things I have ever done. And I've done a lot of good things, since I got sober. I've done quite a few good things, but nothing compares to what happened to me in steps 8 and 9. See, that father that stood in front of me and said, "You're the biggest disappointment I've ever had. I wish you were never born," was at the top of my list. He was at the top of my list. And part of step 8 that I don't hear talked about a lot, but my sponsor was really, really big on is the willingness that's described in step 8. And her interpretation and what she said to me was the willingness that it talks about there is forgiveness. It's in forgiveness. I mean, I had the list I made in step 4. The book tells me that. But she said, in every case, you must be able to forgive these people prior to going to making amends. And because if you go to make amends and still having a resentment, it's fruitless. It's hollow. There's nothing, no substance to it. She said, you have to have forgiven everybody that you make an amends to before you do that. And so we spent a little bit of time doing that. But I remember going to my father and making this amends, and part of my amends was financial to him. And I'd sit down, and as best I could remember, I had tallied up all the money that he'd spent on me in cars and lawyers and things like that. And I'd come up with a number. Now, mind you, this is 1984, and my number was about $30,000. And I sat down with my dad at his desk, and I sat with him, and I talked to him, and I told him what I was doing, and I said, Dad, here's a list of what I think I owe you that I want to pay you back. And he said, I looked at it for a minute, and he said, hold on. And he got up and he walked across the room. He fumbled through a stack of papers, and he pulled a sheet of paper out of the stack, and he brought it back over. And he said, no, actually, this is what you owe me. And it was like $130,000. And I'm like, I don't know how I can pay that back. He said, well, I don't want it back. He said, I don't want it back. I just want you to stay sober. And I took that back to my sponsor, and I said, Dad, I'm so lucky. He doesn't want me to pay him back. And she said, you're going to pay him back. She said, I don't care what he said. He said, you will pay him back. And I said, I don't know how I'm going to do that. And she said, well, you're going to do it a little bit at a time. It's easy. She said, you pay him $20 or $25 a week, whatever you can afford, not take food out of your mouth and off your family's table, and you give it to him, and you keep giving it to him until it's done. Now, I started doing that with my dad, even though he didn't want it. About 7 years sober, my dad got terminal cancer. He had colon cancer that metastasized into his liver, and they gave him 6 months to live. You know, in the last 3 months of his life, there was only one person that he wanted around. And that was that kid that was the biggest disappointment in his life. The one that he wished was never born. You know, when he wanted to share all his regrets and all the things he felt like he hadn't done and where he fell short, and he wanted to tell me that. You know, when he struggled with his own mortality, he knew he was dying and nothing he could do about it. He wanted to talk to me. I remember I was living in Louisville, Kentucky, and I got a call one Sunday night about 10 o'clock that he had went to MD Anderson in Houston to get some special clinical cancer medicine, and he had a terrible reaction. They thought he was going to die, and they said, you probably need to get here. And I jumped in the car about 10 o'clock at night, and I drove straight through to Houston. I got there at noon the next day. Now, it's 1,100 miles in 13 hours. I probably wouldn't have been in the speed limit very well. But, you know, I walked in this hospital room, and you couldn't recognize my father. He had blown up like a balloon, and it was awful. And as I walked in, you know, you see him turn toward the doors, and he gave me, you know, one of these come over here deals. And I walked over to the other side of the bed, and I leaned in because he couldn't talk. His tongue was all swollen up. And I got in close. He said, I just want to tell you how much I love you and how proud I am of you. Again, that's the kid who was the biggest disappointment in his life. Now, I can't do that. Only God can do that. He went back to Raleigh, and he was in a coma dying, and they called me again in Louisville, and I drove to Raleigh, and I walked in the hospital, and the hospital nurse came out, and she said, you need to go in and tell your father that it's okay to go. And I said, I don't understand why. What's that going to do? She said, just shut up. You need to go in. They know this stuff. I don't know how they know it, but they know it. And so I went in and I crawled up in the bed with my dad and I kissed him on the forehead. And I said, Dad, stop suffering. I said, we're going to be okay. We're going to be okay. Please stop suffering. And I kid you not, I got out of the bed. I walked out the door. I went down the hall about 50 yards to buy a drink out of the soda machine. And by the time I came back, my dad had passed. Only God can do that. Only God can leave him alive long enough for me to get there to say goodbye. Only God can repair that relationship. Only God can instill the trust and the confidence in a father who had none with a son who deserved none. Only God can do that. And I remember finishing that, and I began to understand what the book talks about when it says, what that step means to us. And it launches us into this different world, this spiritual world as we walk through that archway. I begin to, we're living this world and it's very different because it's a world of paradoxes. Nothing that I believe was true before is true anymore. See, I lived my life in a completely self-centered, selfish way before I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, and for quite a while after that. And I work these steps and I take this program and I try to put it in my life as best I can. And some days I don't do a good job. But on the days I do, I find myself in the middle of that spiritual world and I find out what my purpose is. One of those questions of life that we all have. Why am I here? What's my purpose? I find my purpose in the middle of the 7-step prayer. When I ask God to remove every single defect of character which stands in the way of my usefulness to you. My purpose is to be useful to that power. How can I best do that? I can best do that by helping its kids. Chamberlain also said there exists but one problem and it contains all problems. That problem is conscious separation from God, from my fellows, and from life itself. I had been separated from God, my fellows, and life itself, and Alcoholics Anonymous reconnected all of those things. It connected me with life, it connected me with you, and it ended up connecting me with a God of my own understanding. And I walk into this place in the book, 84 to 88, which I believe is the complete and total design for living after working the first 9 steps in 5 pages. For me, what I do every day, what I should do every day. Like I said, some days I don't do so well, but other days I do pretty well. That I should wake up every morning and when I wake up, before I make coffee, before I go to the bathroom, before I take a shower, before I read the paper, before I do anything, I should connect with this power. And every morning when my eyes open, I say the same thing. It's not anything complex. I say, God, please let me harm no one today. Please help me to be useful to you. And please help me to pay attention to the opportunities you give me to help your kids. And if you'll do that, I'll do the best that I can to live by those things. And if I can do that, I have a good day. I can't help but have a good day. Then as I walk through my day, the book, I do 5 things as I walk through the day. I watch myself, but I watch for selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, and fear. Character defects, essentially. I watch for these things in my life because they disturb me. When I'm disturbed, I immediately, or at once, I believe it says, I at once ask God to remove them. Kind of step 6 and 7 right there. Then I immediately talk to someone about them, kind of 4 and 5 together. Then I need to make an amends. I make an amends if necessary, steps 8 and 9. And then I resolutely turn my thoughts to someone I could help, step 12. The answer to every problem, if you look at the book, no matter what the problem I have is, the best thing I can do is go help somebody else. That really doesn't make a lot of sense to an alcoholic. Why would I go help somebody else when I'm the one to the problem? That really doesn't make a lot of sense. It makes great sense now, but it didn't make much in the beginning. So I do that, and as I walk through the day, step 11, the other half of it to me gives me an opportunity to catch anything that I might have missed as I walk through the day. I look at my day, and when I retire at night, and I ask myself those 10 questions. You know, and particularly the one I hate the most is, was I kind and loving towards all? You know, it's easy to be kind and loving towards someone who's kind and loving to you. It's pretty easy to be kind and loving to somebody who deserves it. You know, it's not easy to be kind and loving to the crap head at work. It's, you know, trying to make you, or it seems as if they're trying to make you look bad or take your job or whatever it is you made up in your mind that they're trying to do, when they're probably just trying to do the best they can. You know, but if I can do that, I can walk through the day and be all right. And yeah, I got a few minutes. I want to end with, you know, a story that I heard on Mother's Day in 1984 for the first time. Art Graham told it from the podium. It's called the Stained Glass Artisan Story, and I love the story. It's, you know, it starts in a little town in Europe, and it's a small, quaint little town, and they're very devout, and they all worship in the same cathedral. And you know, as the Germans began fighting the war, they carpet bomb everything, and they came to this town and they bombed the whole town, and they blew up the just leveled the cathedral that the people worshiped in. And when it's all over, the townspeople come back together, and their one goal in life is to rebuild this cathedral. But they have no money. You know, everything's destroyed. But they get together with the priest, and they begin to put together a little money, and everything they have a value they bring for sale, and they sell it, and they collect the money, and they do this for weeks and months, and they continue doing this until, you know, at some point they have enough gathered up that they can hire an architect to draw up some plans for this cathedral. And they do that, and they continue as they go along collecting money and gathering money, and they have enough where they can start the construction of this cathedral. And they begin the construction, and the cathedral rises out of the ashes, and they do that, and they come, and they have a contractor that's in charge of all this, and you know, he hires the best artisans in Europe to do these things, the brick masons and the stone masons and the carpenters and all the people, and the tile people, and everybody who put this thing together. And in this church design, there are 3 giant stained glass windows in the cathedral, and he has to find artisans to do the windows, and he very quickly finds 2 artisans for 2 of the windows, but he can't find a 3rd artisan for the window. And he's getting kind of worried about this, and he's sitting in his office one day wondering how he's going to find somebody to do this 3rd window, and the door creaks open, and this little scrawny little guy walks in. He's not that clean, and he's not big, and he's not very he's pretty unkempt, and he walks in. The guy looks up from his desk, doesn't even pay much attention. The guy walks in, in a low whispering kind of voice, he says, "Hey, I hear you're looking for a stained glass artisan." The contractor looks up immediately, says, "Oh my gosh, yes I am. Do you know where I can find one?" He said, "Yeah, I'm a stained glass artisan." He laughs at the guy. He says, "Yeah, sure you are." He said, "Tell me another one." He said, "No, I am." And he said, "I'm really good." And he said, I'd like to do your 3rd window." And the guy said, "I don't think so." And he says, he looks at him, he says, "You know, I tell you what," he said, "I'll make you a deal." He said, "I'll do your 3rd window, and you let me do it. And at the end, if you like it, you pay me what you pay the other artisans. And if you don't like it, I'll walk away." The guy's got nowhere else to go, right? He has nobody else to do it. So he says, "Okay, might as well give it a shot." And the guy starts walking out the office, and he gets to the door, and he stops, and he turns around, and he looks at the contract. He said, "I just have one thing. He said, "What is it?" He said, "I don't like for people to watch me work. If you don't mind, if you could put a curtain up over my window so I can go behind it and work in private." Guy thinks that's pretty odd, but okay. He said, "No problem. I got no real choice." He said, "Show up Monday and come to work." And Monday comes, and the little guy walks in, and he stops, and he begins to talk to the other 2 artisans, and he talks to them about their windows and current events or whatever. And then he disappears up behind the curtain, and every day you hear the faint tapping of a hammer. And time goes by, weeks go by, and it's getting close. Everything else in this cathedral is almost finished. And the contractor comes by one day. He says, "How you doing on the window?" He said, "Yeah, I'm getting pretty close." He said, "Well, you need to finish up, because next week we're going to bring the parishioners around, and they're gonna want to see the church. He said, okay, I'll be done. Comes up the day before, he says, are you done? He said, no, I got a little bit more to do. And he said, all right, we're having a showing tomorrow. We're gonna come in and look at the cathedral with all the parishioners. So the next day comes, and he comes to the guy. He says, are you done? He said, yeah, I'm done. He said, but why don't you take all the parishioners around to the other side of the church, start them over there, let them walk through and see everything. By the time you get here, I'll be done. And the contractor takes all the parishioners around, and they go through the church, and they look at all the amazing woodworking and carpentry and tile work and masonry and stonework. And it's just incredible. They're so overwhelmed with the beauty of this cathedral. And they come around and they get to the windows, and they look up at the other two windows, which are not behind a curtain, and they're just in awe, absolutely amazed. Contractor hollers up to the little guy, says, are you done? He said, yeah, I'm done. I'm coming down now. Comes down to join the group. And as he does, they start to pull back the curtain, and there's just a hush of silence and of wow. People said, oh my gosh, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And the contractor looked at him. He says, what is your name? He said, well, I told you when I came in, my name's not really that important. He said, but let me ask you, do you like my window? He said, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I can't even describe how incredible it is. And the guy says, if you won't tell me what your name is, would you tell me where you got the glass for the window? The guy laughs. He says, yeah, I'll be glad to tell. He said, I came in every morning. I stopped. I talked to the other two artisans as I walked in, stood and spent a little time with them. And he said, yeah. He said, well, as I did that, I would reach down in their garbage can, and I would pull out their trash, the glass that they had thrown away. He said, the glass that I use for my window is made from the discards of the other two artisans. Now, that's just a story. But it's kind of the story of my life, and probably the story of your life. See, I'm a kid whose society had thrown away. My parents had thrown away. Everybody'd given up hope. I'd given up hope. But, I drop in the garbage can of Alcoholics Anonymous here, and people like Lee Calder and Mary Nell Newcomb and Dave Cook and Bryant Bibbins and Tom Iverson and Art Graham, and I could go on and on and on and on. Reach down and they pick up the broken pieces of my life. Then they begin to put them in a tapestry that's built by God and Alcoholics Anonymous. But it's turned into a life that I can't even imagine. So I hope, if I've not done anything, that there's somebody here that feels a little hopeless. But maybe they have a little more hope now than they did about an hour ago. Because I don't care how hopeless you are, Alcoholics Anonymous will save your life. The program of AA and the people in AA and the God that you will find and discover in the steps of this program will save your life and give you a life that you can't imagine. Doesn't mean it's always going to be good, but it is going to mean that I can always get through anything. And I can do it with dignity and integrity and honesty. And I can look you in the eye, and I can tell you the truth, and I can be exactly who I am, which is many people call me all the time. I'm just an idiot. I'm just a guy, but I'm a guy who Alcoholics Anonymous and God have touched with an understanding of what my purpose is and why I'm here. And my purpose here is to be useful. See, if I take care of God's kids, God takes care of me. My job is to take care of you. God's job is to take care of me. If I stay in my lane and just try to do for you everything I can do when every opportunity I have, then I never have to worry. See, my life no longer becomes my business. My life's God's business. And what I can do for you is my business. And as more I can focus on that, the better my life gets. The more I can focus on that, the happier I get, the joy I get. Now, you no longer have to look for happiness. I look for happiness all my life. I come to Alcoholics Anonymous, find out I don't have to look for it. I just have to live a spiritual life, and happiness finds me. Happiness, joy, success, at some level finds me. So if you don't think you can be any of those things, come in. Get somebody who's properly armed with the facts about themselves. Follow their instructions as it relates to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and how they got sober and stay sober. And you'll get what they got. I've never seen it happen any other way. Guys, thank you so much for listening. And Stephen, thank you again for asking me. It's always great to be with you. I love you guys.